Tonight, we're headed back to a time when entire ecosystems thought, let's glue ourselves together into a weird blob and see what happens, was an actual survival strategy. Welcome to Planet Shmearth, the slowest, driest, most sarcastic history lesson you'll ever fall asleep to. Subscribe whenever you wake up. Now, let's start where the planet left its dignity, right about here. The oxygen boom had finally settled into its new normal. If you could call half the biosphere dead, the other half slightly smug about it, normal. Anaerobes, once the reigning monarchs of Earth's microbial scene, were now the evolutionary equivalent of those people who move into off-grid cabins and post about it online, reclusive, bitter, and convinced everyone else was doing it wrong. They clung to hydrothermal vents, deep sediments, and the kind of chemical niches so toxic that no self-respecting oxygen breather would bother showing up. Good for them. The aerobes strutted across the microbial world like they'd just invented electricity. Their metabolisms were sleeker, their energy budgets larger, and they burned through resources like rock stars trashing hotel rooms. They weren't just surviving, they were inventing new tricks, complex cell structures, compartments, and worst of all, the creeping beginnings of teamwork. Eukaryotes, who already had a flair for drama with their overcomplicated cell interiors, were getting serious about cooperation. Not just the let's not eat each other today kind, but actual division of labor. Some cells handling defense, some managing structure, others freeloading while pretending to be vital to the collective. Primitive communication cropped up, chemical signals that essentially said, do this, stop that, or, oh no, predator incoming. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was a start. Predators were also stepping up their game. Some extended pseudopodia like sticky arms, reaching out to engulf prey with a slow-motion inevitability that would be nightmare fuel if anything had eyes yet. Others started deploying chemical warfare, squirting toxins or digestive enzymes into their targets, a strategy that says, I could eat you the normal way, but this is more fun. Mimicry appeared too. Harmless microbes pretending to be toxic ones, the evolutionary equivalent of putting a fake security sticker on your front door. Naturally, prey didn't take this lying down, unless they were literally lying down, which some did, in an attempt to look dead. Others grew shells, built slime shields, or mastered invisibility by blending into the murky, nutrient-rich soup. The arms race was on, and nobody was winning except natural selection, which frankly didn't care who lived or died as long as it got to keep experimenting. Even microbial mats, those sprawling, gelatinous cities of life clinging to rocks and sediments, started to change. They developed layers for different purposes, outer defenses laced with toxins, middle layers for storage and waste management, inner sanctums for delicate processes. It was like a medieval castle, but smellier and made entirely of slime. Parasitism emerged as an exciting new career path. Some microbes ditched the hassle of hunting entirely and just lived inside other organisms, siphoning nutrients while contributing nothing. Hosts responded with thicker cell walls, chemical traps, or just flat-out dying to spite the invaders. Waste recycling systems evolved, ensuring nutrients flowed in neat little cycles instead of piling up in revolting heaps. The microbial world's first stab at sustainability. For a brief, glorious moment, mixotrophs ruled the day. Why choose between photosynthesis and hunting when you can do both? They were the smug hybrids of the era, boasting about their versatility until the climate shifted and reminded them that adaptability doesn't mean immortality. Colony life flourished. Organisms glued themselves together with extracellular matrices, divvied up roles like a microscopic corporate office, and started passing messages along chemical signaling networks. These weren't nerves yet, but you could see the early ambition. One day, we'll overcomplicate this until it runs on electrical impulses and gets migraines. And then came the cold. Methane slipped away from the atmosphere, oxygen levels climbed higher, and Earth drifted toward a proto-slushball state. Seas iced over, coastlines froze, and life clung to any warm pocket it could find. Cold-tolerant species thrived. Everyone else either went dormant, died, or built colonies designed to weather the chill in modular pieces. Multicellular body plans started locking in. Tubes for channeling fluids, sheets for covering surfaces, spheres for existing in a vaguely geometric way. Horizontal gene transfer sped up innovation, letting life steal good ideas from its neighbors without the bother of evolving them independently. Symbiosis took root, partnerships forming between species that could actually tolerate each other. And somewhere, in damp cracks of newly colonized soil, life made its first timid forays onto land. Nothing spectacular yet, just biofilms in shaded crevices, testing the air like a nervous animal sniffing a new room. The climate began to rebound. Nutrient blooms flared across the oceans, feeding another wave of expansion. And in the middle of it all, that mysterious blob from the end of last episode was still around, still dividing, still not telling anyone what it planned to do. Which frankly made it even more suspicious. It just kept dividing, endlessly, pointlessly. Like that one acquaintance who keeps starting side hustles without ever finishing the last one. And while the blob was busy auditioning for least impressive mystery of the eon, Earth was busy cooking up its next big personality shift. The oceans, recently thawed from their icy sulk, decided to get lively again. And by lively, I mean they became a bubbling chemical soup where everything smelled faintly of farts and ambition. Oxygen was now less of a novelty and more of a public nuisance. Sure, it powered flashy metabolisms and gave aerobes their inflated sense of self-worth, but it also rusted anything iron-based into uselessness, suffocated the wrong organisms, and generally acted like that over-enthusiastic co-worker who keeps helping in ways nobody asked for. With energy to burn, life started stretching its metaphorical legs. Not actual legs, not yet, calm down. And diversifying into forms that would have been unthinkable back when the only survival plan was, don't die. Some organisms developed intricate filaments to filter feed, dragging in whatever floated by, dead or alive. Others went the opposite route, becoming streamlined, slippery predators that moved with all the grace of a drunken noodle, but somehow still got the job done. Colonies became more organized, not in a dignified utopian way, but more like a group project where half the members are competent and the rest just show up for snacks. Signals passed faster along chemical networks, turning into proto-gossip chains that could alert an entire mat to danger or, more often, to the arrival of fresh nutrients. A few ambitious lineages began to experiment with structural symmetry, tubes inside tubes, stacked sheets, radial arrangements, because even in the Precambrian, aesthetics mattered if you wanted to impress the neighbors. Meanwhile, the land, still just damp, gritty real estate, was slowly becoming less of a death sentence. Weathering rocks released nutrients into the soil, forming thin layers of proto-dirt. Microbial films crept farther inland, testing sunlight angles like picky influencers finding their best side. They excreted sticky substances to hold themselves in place against wind and the occasional splattering rain, effectively inventing nature's first glue traps. Predation continued to escalate because of course it did. Some hunters learned to lurk inside colonies, bursting out only when prey passed close enough to grab. Others developed barbed extensions, stabbing and holding victims like skewered appetizers. One lineage began spitting digestive enzymes in a lazy, let the food come to me approach that somehow caught on, leading to the world's earliest chemical arms race. And all the while, Earth kept shifting under their feet, or whatever counted as feet. Tectonic plates wandered like distracted toddlers, colliding into proto-continents, pulling apart again and sending volcanic belches into the atmosphere just to keep things interesting. These outbursts dumped minerals into the oceans, feeding blooms that choked entire regions, killed off competitors, and then collapsed spectacularly when they ran out of nutrients. It was the boom and bust cycle of life millions of years before economics ruined the term. Every so often, a lineage would stumble onto a brilliant innovation, say, efficient internal nutrient transport, only for the climate to shift and wipe out most of the early adopters. But the survivors, they'd cling on looking smug even if no one was left to notice, and somewhere beneath all this chaos, deep in the muck, small cooperative groups of cells were slowly refining the blueprint for something bigger. Not big in a dramatic, cinematic way, more like big enough to require more than one mouth or whatever passed for a mouth back then. It was the quiet groundwork for a future where life wouldn't just exist. It would complicate itself into oblivion, which, if we're being honest, is the only real long-term plan Earth has ever committed to. As these microscopic architects plotted their unnecessarily complicated futures, the oceans decided to meddle. Currents shifted, stirring up deep, nutrient-packed waters and dumping them into shallower zones like some careless waiter sloshing soup. The result? Blooms. So many blooms. Great green gelatinous slicks that turned coastlines into pulsating carpets of smug photosynthesizers. If you were a predator, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. If you were anything else, it was like being buried alive in damp spinach. Multicellular life was slowly learning that being made of more than one cell meant you could try new things. Like becoming the biological equivalent of a modular sofa. Segments could break off, float away, and, if they didn't die immediately, start their own colony. It was reproduction meets laziness, and for some reason, it worked. Symbiosis got bolder. One species of cell would move into another's space, promising to help with photosynthesis or nutrient processing and somehow not get kicked out. This arrangement usually started as a polite partnership and ended with one partner doing all the work while the other loafed around. Proof that codependence is as old as life itself. On land, those pioneering biofilms were upgrading. They built thicker, more rubbery surfaces to keep from drying out, trapping water underneath like sweaty little green carpets. Windstorms ripped at them, and they clung harder, excreting stickier glue until even passing dust got welded into place. The result was the first crusty soils, not the rich, dark stuff you'd plant tomatoes in, but a crunchy, grimy layer that said, yes, technically we are land now. And in the quieter, colder waters, some organisms began constructing skeletal frameworks inside their bodies, primitive support systems made from minerals they stole from the water. These weren't impressive yet. Think flimsy drinking straws jammed inside a jelly blob. But they hinted at a future where structural engineering might actually matter. Predators, of course, took note. If prey were getting armor, they needed better tools. Some evolved serrated extensions, others developed acid sprays that could dissolve defenses, and a few just got bigger, not better, just bigger, and crushed their meals by sheer force. It wasn't elegant, but elegance has never been Earth's strong suit. Farther offshore, tectonic mischief was busy rewriting the map. Supercontinents assembled themselves like awkward puzzle pieces, only to crack apart again a few 100 million years later. Every collision sent mountain chains rising and erosion kicking sediment into the seas, where it buried old ecosystems under choking layers of grit. A tragedy for them, a blank canvas for whatever came next. And in that sediment, buried deep away from sunlight and oxygen, anaerobes were still hanging on, quietly judging everyone else, muttering about how much better things used to be. They weren't wrong exactly, just irrelevant, which, frankly, is the safest evolutionary strategy Earth has to offer. Meanwhile, up in the oxygen-rich, drama-filled shallows, the show-offs were busy making history. Not that they knew what history was. They were too busy trying out increasingly ridiculous body plans. Some flattened themselves into wide, undulating sheets to catch more light, looking like someone had ironed a jellyfish. Others went vertical, growing stalks topped with feeding structures because if you can't move, you might as well loom ominously. Currents kept shifting, turning some regions into nutrient jackpots while leaving others starving for centuries at a time. This, of course, drove waves of migration, which is a fancy way of saying that microscopic life drifted aimlessly until it landed somewhere better. Sometimes better meant rich in food. Sometimes it just meant not immediately lethal. Standards were low. On the seafloor, colonies were starting to flirt with actual engineering. Some built elaborate towers out of mucus and sediment, with internal channels for nutrient flow, the world's first plumbing if you're generous and have no sense of smell. Others developed cooperative filtering systems where one organism sucked in water, stripped out the food, and passed the leftovers to its neighbors like an over-enthusiastic host serving stale snacks. Predators responded in kind. They began targeting weak points in colonies, slipping between structural gaps like burglars who knew the floor plan. Chemical weapons became more specialized. Acids that worked only on certain shell types, toxins that disrupted communication signals, and enzymes so potent they could melt through a mucus tower in minutes. It was brutal, but in the kind of way evolution applauds. Farther inland, and I use inland loosely here because we're still talking a few meters from the waterline, life was getting bolder. Mats spread into cracks, hollows, and shallow pools, learning to survive repeated drying and rewetting. Some formed tough, crusty exteriors that flaked off like bad clay pottery, revealing living layers underneath. Every flake was an advertisement. We didn't die. You might not either. The climate, as always, refused to commit to anything stable. Glacial pulses crept in, cooling the tropics and locking away water in ice sheets, then retreated in slow, slushy defeats. Sea levels rose and fell like an indecisive landlord, alternately flooding and exposing coastal zones. For marine life, it was an endless cycle of boom, bust, and relocation. And in the quiet aftermath of each environmental tantrum, a few new innovations stuck. Some organisms developed internal compartments for storing nutrients, turning themselves into microscopic survival pantries. Others formed partnerships where one species handled energy production and the other took care of waste management, essentially outsourcing their least favorite chores. Through it all, Earth just kept spinning, pretending it had some grand plan, while its surface filled with increasingly complicated, petty, and absurdly overbuilt life forms, which, given what's coming next, was exactly the sort of overconfidence they were going to regret. Though to be fair, regret isn't really an option when you don't have a brain. What you do have is time. Millions of years of it, and apparently the collective patience to keep trying increasingly absurd designs until something sticks. Some lineages went minimalist, paring down their complexity to the evolutionary equivalent of a studio apartment. Why bother with specialized parts when you can just be a shapeless blob and let the environment do the heavy lifting? Others went maximalist, adding more and more specialized cells until their own internal logistics became a full-time job. One early attempt at this collapsed spectacularly when it turned out their transport system could only deliver nutrients in one direction. Evolution didn't so much applaud this effort as laugh and quietly file the idea under needs work. The seas themselves were still the main stage, and they had a flair for the dramatic. Nutrient-rich upwellings painted entire coastlines in swirls of green and gold, while deeper waters simmered in oxygen-poor gloom like forgotten soup. Some organisms adapted to these layers, shuttling between them like commuters who couldn't decide which neighborhood they hated less. A few even pulled off the trick of surviving both extremes, though it made them perpetually stressed and slightly twitchy. On the continental shelves, early reef-like structures were beginning to rise, not the colorful postcard reefs you're picturing, but lumpy, clay-textured mounds of living slime and mineral grit. Think damp papier-mâché projects left out in the rain, except they were full of tiny creatures ready to bite, sting, or dissolve anything that touched them. These mounds reshaped water flow, creating sheltered pockets where new species could try out ill-advised body plans in peace. The landward edge kept creeping forward, mats and crusts gaining ground in a slow-motion siege against bare rock. Rainfall carried more minerals from the continents, staining tidal zones in streaks of rusty orange and deep green. Every storm was both a disaster and an opportunity. Waves ripped apart colonies but also left behind new real estate for the survivors to colonize. And down in the muck, hidden from all this above-ground drama, genetic swapping was reaching absurd levels. Horizontal gene transfer turned the microbial world into a chaotic, open-source free-for-all. If your neighbor had a useful adaptation, you could just take it. No waiting, no natural selection required. Just grab the code and run. It was identity theft as a survival strategy, and it worked far too well. Through all of it, the planet's chemistry kept drifting toward something more stable, or at least less murderous. Oxygen levels found a sort of uneasy equilibrium, enough to power the big, flashy metabolisms without choking out everything else. The stage was set for the next great leap in complexity, though whether it would be a triumph or another billion-year pratfall was anyone's guess, though Earth's track record suggested both, and also somehow worse, was the safest bet. The oceans, clearly bored with their current lineup, began experimenting with circulation patterns again. Deep, cold currents started dragging nutrients from the abyss to the surface in grand, swirling updrafts, like a waiter bringing a suspiciously chunky soup to the table. Predictably, this sparked another round of explosive blooms, shimmering, clay-textured slicks that spread for kilometers, waving smugly in the current, as if they'd invented photosynthesis yesterday. This bounty triggered population booms all the way up the food web, which, in microbial terms, meant slightly bigger blobs eating slightly smaller blobs with slightly more enthusiasm. Predators learned to stake out bloom edges, the biological equivalent of waiting by the dessert table at a bad wedding reception. They struck with sticky tendrils, coiling pseudopods, or clouds of dissolving enzymes that turned their victims into convenient puddles. Somewhere in this swirling mess, a few organisms began stacking themselves into genuine three-dimensional shapes, not just flat mats or lazy spheres, but layered towers and frilled curtains of living tissue, textured like hand-molded clay props in a school play about the ocean. These shapes trapped water, funneled food, and confused predators who suddenly had to navigate a maze just to get lunch. Land, still lagging behind in the things happening department, got a little more interesting. Seasonal flooding spread microbial mats far inland, leaving crusty, colorful stains on rock faces and filling cracks with greenish slime. Some colonies figured out how to form dormant spores, waiting out dry spells like smug time travelers who knew the next rainstorm was inevitable. Others went for broke, growing thicker and stickier, trying to survive by sheer stubbornness. And then came the tectonic drama. Supercontinent fragments drifted, collided, and rearranged themselves like a drunk trying to reassemble IKEA furniture without instructions. Each smash-up raised mountains, reshaped coastlines, and sent shockwaves through climate systems. Warm periods collapsed into chills. Deserts formed in one place while new shallow seas opened somewhere else. For life, it was like moving the furniture around every few million years just to see who trips over it. In the middle of all this chaos, Symbiosis kept evolving from helpful collaboration into long-term entanglement. Some partnerships became so intertwined that neither partner could survive alone anymore. It wasn't romance. More like an old married couple who stay together because separating the bank accounts would be too much hassle. And as the climate swung between wet and dry, warm and cold, a few particularly bold lineages began tinkering with mobility. Nothing fancy, just slow, pulsing contractions or awkward shape-shifting to ooze a few millimeters in search of food. It wasn't speed, but on Earth, even bad movement was still better than sitting around waiting to be eaten. Although plenty still did that, because hopelessly stationary was still a viable lifestyle choice. Mobility, however, came with hazards. If you moved, you risked wandering into the wrong chemical zone, drifting into the digestive radius of something hungrier, or just getting stuck in a current you couldn't fight. The early movers weren't sleek, graceful pioneers. They were lumpy, clay-textured blobs awkwardly scooting through the water column, leaving little trails of disturbed silt like toddlers dragging a blanket across the floor. Some tried combining mobility with colony life. A bad idea on paper, and even worse in practice. The result was a slow, gelatinous caravan that couldn't decide on a direction, with individuals peeling off mid-journey to set up shop somewhere better. They didn't last long, but they made excellent food for the organisms lurking behind them. Meanwhile, Earth's chemistry was still a moody mess. Volcanic eruptions burped out gases that toyed with atmospheric composition. sometimes triggering brief warming spells, other times plunging the climate back into chilly instability. Every change in temperature meant rearranging who lived where, as if the planet was running an endless, badly organized game of musical chairs where the chairs were entire ecosystems. Shallow seas were the hotbeds of invention. Warm, sunlit waters churned with life experimenting at high speed. Layered mats forming miniature forests, frilly tendrils waving like parade floats, armored spheres drifting in slow, ominous spirals. Clay-like reefs grew taller and more complex, with internal cavities that served as both nurseries and death traps, depending on your role in the food chain. Predators naturally kept pushing the envelope. Some evolved grappling filaments tipped with barbs, others learned to wrap around prey in suffocating spirals, and a few developed the unsettling ability to inject digestive enzymes directly into their targets. It was messy, efficient, and almost certainly hilarious to watch if you were too big to be on the menu. On land, or at least land in the sense of rock that isn't currently underwater, biofilms became more adventurous. They colonized cliff faces, wind-exposed flats, and the undersides of loose stones, creating patchy clay-colored mosaics that trapped dust and moisture. Occasionally, whole sheets would peel off in the wind, fluttering away like the planet was shedding badly fired pottery. And beneath it all, in the deep sediments and tucked away hydrothermal vents, the anaerobes still clung to their chemical comfort zones. They didn't move, they didn't innovate, and they certainly didn't care what the oxygen breathers were up to. Which, given the chaos above, might have been the smartest move of all, though calling anything on Earth smart at this stage is a stretch. Up in the oxygenated chaos, the trend toward complexity kept snowballing. Not because it was a great idea, but because life still hadn't learned how to leave well enough alone. Some lineages began building rigid internal supports out of calcium carbonate, the mineral equivalent of propping yourself up with cheap scaffolding. Others ditched rigidity entirely and doubled down on flexibility, turning themselves into animated ribbons that could wrap, twist, and coil like some over-enthusiastic piece of clay stop-motion animation. The reefs, still ugly, still lumpy, still objectively disappointing if you were hoping for future coral glamour, kept expanding. Layer upon layer of mineralized gunk glued together by microbial mucus created little fortress cities. Inside, residents squabbled over light and space, chemical signals zipping around like angry post-it notes stuck to the walls. Predators learned to exploit this vertical terrain. Some drifted above the reefs, dangling tendrils into crevices like fishing lines, while others burrowed through the structure itself, popping out in surprise attacks that would have been terrifying if anything here had the capacity for fear. On the continental shelves, mats kept innovating in the be slightly less terrible at surviving category. They built protective crusts that cracked dramatically during low tides, releasing tiny bursts of moisture and occasionally unlucky hitchhikers. Wind-scoured zones saw mats layer themselves under dust and sediment, wearing gritty disguises to avoid being scraped off entirely. Meanwhile, climate change, the ancient original version, not the modern human-flavored one, kept shaking the Etch-a-Sketch. Warm periods brought expanded shallow seas and massive algal booms. Cold snaps iced over coastlines and sent ocean circulation into sulky disarray. Every shift wiped out some lineages and handed opportunities to others, which was great for innovation and terrible for anyone invested in stability. And yet, despite the turnover, one slow-burn trend was undeniable. cooperative systems were getting better at being cooperative. Some colonies began to develop specialized openings for nutrient intake and waste output, effectively inventing primitive mouths and back doors. Others fine-tuned their internal signaling, creating coordinated pulses that looked suspiciously like choreography, if choreography involved mostly flailing. All of it pointed toward the same inconvenient truth. Earth was inching toward something bigger, more structured, and probably more ridiculous than anything so far. And because this is Earth, it was bound to overcomplicate itself right into the next catastrophe, because on Earth, progress and disaster are basically roommates. The oceans, never content to let life relax, decided to shuffle their chemistry again. Trace minerals surged in from eroding continents, turning entire coastlines into shimmering clay-colored soup. For photosynthesizers, this was like mainlining espresso. For everyone else, it was a game of adapt now or become decorative sediment. Blooms erupted with the enthusiasm of a toddler discovering glitter. Vast sheets of green, gold, and rusty red smeared across the shallows, clumping into thick, undulating mats that rolled in the waves like soggy carpets. They trapped heat, choked competitors, and occasionally broke apart in dramatic, foul-smelling plumes that drifted out to sea like passive-aggressive eviction notices. Predators adapted by circling these mats in slow, deliberate loops, waiting for the inevitable moment when a clump tore free. They'd swarm the detached chunk, piercing, dissolving, or simply engulfing the unlucky residents. If you looked closely and could somehow tolerate the stench, it was almost beautiful, in the same way a claymation food fight is beautiful. Meanwhile, on the rocky edges of the continents, mats were digging in deeper. They sent filaments down into cracks, weaving themselves into the stone like stubborn weeds. Wind-blown dust cemented into their surfaces, giving them a patchy ceramic glaze that cracked under the sun. When storms tore them loose, the pieces tumbled into tide pools, seeding new outposts like badly wrapped care packages. In deeper waters, structural experimentation was getting ambitious. Some multicellular blobs started building internal channels, circulating water and nutrients through their bodies like a very slow plumbing system. Others created repeating modular body units, like clay bricks stacked into awkward living walls. They weren't fast, they weren't elegant, but they were increasingly hard to kill, which on Earth counts as high praise. And then there were the opportunists, life forms that ditched innovation entirely in favor of scavenging. They slithered into abandoned reef cavities, lurked in the shadows of larger colonies, and stole food straight from the mouths or mouth equivalents of their neighbors. They thrived without contributing anything useful, proving once again that laziness is a perfectly valid evolutionary strategy. All of this played out under a sky that still couldn't decide on a mood. Cloud cover thickened and thinned unpredictably. Temperatures swung like an indecisive pendulum, and the occasional volcanic outburst turned entire regions into sooty, dim-lit test kitchens for survival strategies. The chaos wasn't going away, it was becoming the norm, which, inconveniently for everything alive, meant the planet was about to hand them an even bigger challenge. And as usual, Earth didn't send a warning memo. No polite geological bulletin saying, "Brace yourselves, things are about to get weird." Instead, it just started turning the thermostat in slow, petty increments, enough to make life uncomfortable without immediately killing everything. Sea levels crept higher, swallowing some of the prime coastal real estate that Mats and Colonies had spent millions of years elbowing each other over. New shallow seas opened up inland, shimmering like fresh opportunity, or fresh death traps, depending on your skill set. For a while, these new waters were a buffet full of sunlight, minerals, and space to sprawl. Then they inevitably turned into overcrowded cesspools because, well, life never knows when to stop. Currents went rogue, rearranging nutrient flows so that once lush regions starved while former wastelands bloomed. It was like the planet had shuffled its entire oceanographic deck just to see who would blink first. Some species adapted by becoming migratory drifters, hitching rides on favorable currents like lazy clay rafts. Others doubled down on fortifying their home turf, building thicker walls, stronger attachments, and chemical booby traps for would-be invaders. In the deeper, darker zones, slow burn experiments were underway. Some organisms flirted with bioluminescence, dim, eerie glows meant to attract prey or confuse predators. Others evolved delicate, feathery feeding structures that swayed in the current like clay stop-motion sea anemones trying to look innocent. A few lineages even started dabbling in partial predation, mixing photosynthesis with the occasional casual murder for extra nutrients. On land, such as it was, mats kept creeping farther from the shoreline. They rode seasonal floods into low basins, baking in place until the next rain reanimated them like damp, resentful sponges. Some grew pigment shields to tolerate longer sun exposure, turning their surfaces deep reds, purples, and almost black sheens. From a distance, they looked like burnt clay tiles scattered across the rocks, which was both beautiful and unsettling when you realized they were alive. And then, without any sense of timing, tectonics decided to add fuel to the chaos. Continents shifted again, opening fresh seaways while smashing other regions together in slow-motion collisions that sent mountains crawling skyward. Erosion from these new peaks bled minerals into rivers, feeding even more coastal blooms and accelerating the already ridiculous evolutionary arms race, which meant the stage was now set for something truly excessive, the kind of evolutionary leap that would make everything before it look like a dress rehearsal, performed entirely by damp, shapeless extras. Multicellular life, after millions of years of awkward trial and error, finally began to commit to more elaborate blueprints. Some went for branching, frond-like structures that swayed in the current like they were auditioning for an interpretive dance recital no one had agreed to attend. Others bulked up into squat, layered domes, clay-textured bunkers bristling with defensive spines and mucus-coated protrusions that dared anything to try taking a bite. Circulatory systems, crude but effective, began appearing in some lineages. These weren't exactly hearts, more like glorified peristaltic pumps that pushed water and nutrients around in slow rhythmic shoves. Still, compared to the hope the tide brings food method, it was a breakthrough worthy of smugness. Predators responded in the only way they knew how, by getting meaner. New hunting strategies emerged, coordinated strikes, partial digestion before swallowing, and even chemical lures that tricked prey into swimming straight into a death hug. If you could translate the microbial gossip of the time, it probably read like a cautionary pamphlet titled "Don't go near anything that smells interesting." On the fringes of the continents, mats had become unshakable fixtures. Some colonies fused with mineral deposits, effectively turning themselves into part of the rock. When storms ripped away the softer layers, they revealed jagged, multicolored ridges, that looked like someone had decorated the coastline with rough, hand-molded clay sculptures. They weren't pretty, but they were durable. And on Earth, doesn't die instantly is as close to luxury as it gets. Farther inland, occasional freshwater pools appeared, fed by seasonal rains and runoff from the rising mountains. These pools became micro-laboratories for survival, testing who could handle low salinity, fluctuating temperatures, and the occasional complete drying out. A few pioneers managed it, forming dormant cysts that could wait months, or even years, before springing back to life. It was less thriving and more extreme loitering, but it worked. And in the deeper ocean, away from the photogenic chaos of the shallows, slow-motion titans began to emerge. Large, soft-bodied grazers floated through the gloom, hoovering up planktonic life like claymation parade balloons with an eating problem. They moved so lazily that predators could practically set a calendar by their arrival. But if you were big enough, you didn't have to rush. The balance between chaos and stability was starting to tip. Ecosystems, while still prone to mass wipeouts, were lasting longer between total resets. And in that extra breathing room, life was quietly, dangerously building toward its next major act of overcomplication, which, knowing Earth, would involve an obscene amount of mucus, teeth where teeth shouldn't be, and some creature deciding gravity was optional. Nutrient cycles tightened their grip on the oceans. Waste wasn't just waste anymore, it was currency. One organism's excrement became another's 5-course meal passed through the food web like a disgusting relay baton. The result was an unsettlingly efficient system where nothing went unused for long and the water carried the faint tang of recycled ambition. Reefs expanded into sprawling, labyrinthine fortresses. What started as lumpy, clay-textured mounds now sported twisting corridors, vaulted chambers, and precarious overhangs just waiting to collapse on something unlucky. Life filled every crevice. Filter feeders waving frilly appendages like desperate street vendors, lurking predators with slow, deliberate movements, and scavengers cleaning up the mess in an eternal, slow-motion janitorial shift. In the open water, the grazers got bigger. Some ballooned into wide, flattened discs that drifted like lazy dinner plates, scooping plankton into sticky, ciliated maws. Others stretched into undulating ribbons, rippling through the current with unsettling grace. The kind of motion that would look mesmerizing in claymation and mildly horrifying in real life. Predators, unwilling to be left behind, grew faster and trickier. Some developed stealth approaches, drifting motionless until they could launch a sudden, flabby pounce. Others relied on brute force, barreling through the water with mouths open, filtering out anything edible and a fair amount that wasn't. Collateral damage was just part of the business model. On land, the advance continued, not fast, not dramatic, but relentless. Mats adapted to harsher sunlight with thicker pigment layers, producing deep, iridescent colors that made them look like glossy ceramic tiles slapped onto the rock. A few formed spongy mats that trapped water so well they created tiny, self-sustaining puddles. Micro-wetlands full of freeloaders. The climate for once behaved, briefly. Temperatures hovered in a range that didn't instantly destroy everything. Currents stabilized just enough to keep nutrient flows predictable, and storms became more seasonal than chaotic. This fragile stability was the perfect breeding ground for reckless innovation. And life took full advantage. And somewhere in the middle of all this cautious prosperity, the first real hints of specialized directional movement appeared. organisms began coordinating entire body plans toward going somewhere on purpose, not just drifting or flailing, but moving with intent. It was slow, clumsy, and full of wrong turns, but it was also the start of something big in the sense that big meant still tiny but with enough ego to think it matters. These early directional movers weren't exactly graceful. Some jerked forward in uneven bursts, like clay stop-motion figures being animated by a bored intern. Others relied on coordinated waves of cilia, propelling themselves with all the urgency of someone reluctantly getting out of bed. The important part wasn't speed. It was the sheer audacity of trying to control where they ended up. This opened a whole new evolutionary arms race. If you could go toward food instead of waiting for it to come to you, congratulations. You were now in the slightly less doomed category. Of course, if you could go toward food, predators could go toward you, so the prey immediately started working on escape strategies. Some got faster, some got sneakier, some just became so unappetizing, chemically, structurally, or in sheer attitude, that predators decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Meanwhile, reefs turned into vertical cities. Towering spires of mineral and mucus rose from the sea floor, casting shadows over the plains below. Openings and arches became ambush points. Frilled ledges hosted miniature gardens of filter feeders, and entire neighborhoods existed solely for scavengers waiting for something else to die. It was bustling, busy, and absolutely terrifying if you were smaller than a grain of rice. On land, mats didn't just sit there anymore. They began creeping, millimeter by millimeter, into new spaces between wet seasons. Some sent out exploratory filaments that could survive partial drying, like cautious scouts poking their heads around a corner. Others perfected the art of hitchhiking on debris, clinging to clay-textured chunks that storms carried inland. They were slow, they were sticky, and they were impossible to evict. In the water column, body plans diversified again. Some creatures grew elongated and tapered, streamlining their shapes to slip through currents without wasting energy. Others bulked up, using sheer mass as a defense, floating like clay blimps that dared anything to try eating them whole. And then there were the experimenters, the ones growing odd fins, flaps, and ridges just to see if they helped. Most didn't. But every now and then one did, and suddenly that awkward growth became the hottest trend in the ocean. Earth, for its part, seemed to be enjoying this phase. The climate stayed steady long enough for ecosystems to actually establish themselves without being immediately obliterated, which, of course, only meant one thing. The planet was overdue for another round of chaos, and Earth never misses an opportunity to ruin a good thing. The first signs were subtle. A few seasons running longer than they should, currents taking slightly different routes, storms showing up where they hadn't been invited in millions of years. Then came the bigger shifts. Ice began creeping back into higher latitudes, advancing like an unhurried but very determined landlord. Temperatures slid just low enough to mess with all the delicate balances life had been congratulating itself for maintaining. Blooms thinned in some regions and exploded in others, creating bizarre patchworks of abundance and scarcity. Predators that had spent eons perfecting the art of hunting in one environment suddenly found themselves unemployed and, frankly, bad at job retraining. Some wandered into new habitats and did fine. Others wandered into new habitats and immediately became lunch. The reefs, those gaudy mucus and mineral cities, suffered in the cooler waters. Growth slowed, colors dulled, and sections crumbled under increased wave action. This created an explosion of new rubble fields, which opportunists colonized like squatters in a foreclosed building. Filter feeders set up shop in the gaps, scavengers patrolled the debris, and predators lingered nearby just in case something interesting got careless. On land, the creeping mats had mixed fortunes. Some perished in the colder, drier spells, their glossy, clay-like surfaces cracking apart into brittle flakes that blew away like forgotten pottery shards. Others, blessed with better pigments or more stubborn glue, hunkered down and waited it out, shrinking into hardened crusts that could revive with just a few hours of moisture. In the open ocean, body plans began to change again under the pressure. Streamlined forms became even more efficient, conserving every ounce of energy in cooler, less predictable currents. Bulkier grazers either adapted by storing more energy internally, turning into floating, clay-colored dumplings, or faded into extinction. And because Earth can't resist irony, this environmental stress kicked innovation into overdrive. Directional movement got faster, feeding strategies became more specialized. Predator-prey interactions turned into elaborate games of misdirection, speed bursts, and fake-outs that would have made an Olympic coach proud. All of it was a reminder that here, survival wasn't about stability. It was about having just enough new tricks to stay one miserable step ahead of everything trying to eat you, dissolve you, or steal your prime, sunlit real estate. Which, to be fair, was most of the neighborhood. The colder pulse didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough for the survivors to get cocky about it. When the climate swung back toward warmer, wetter conditions, it was like lifting the lid off a long-forgotten soup pot. Everything erupted at once. Blooms surged across the shallows in lurid swaths of green and gold, thick enough to look like Earth had been wrapped in a mossy quilt. Predators came flooding back, slipping between the mats like clay-textured eels, scooping up anything slow, distracted, or stupid. In the open water, streamlined hunters now shared the stage with bulkier, heavily armored grazers. Some carried plates of mineralized armor that clinked together like badly fitted clay shingles. Others wore flexible, ridged shells that flexed as they swam, giving them the unsettling appearance of breathing dinnerware. If predators minded, they didn't show it. They just got better at prying. Reefs, given a reprieve from the cold, started building again with the manic energy of someone who'd procrastinated a major project and just remembered the deadline. Spindly towers shot upward, their clay-like textures layered in ridges and lumps that made them look handcrafted. Inside, a full cast of specialists returned. Filter feeders, ambushers, cleaners, and the inevitable freeloaders wedged into prime real estate they hadn't earned. On land, mats took full advantage of warmer, wetter cycles. They advanced inland during rainy seasons, forming sprawling, slick expanses that glued loose stones together into crude, clay-colored pavement. Pools of trapped water became mini ecosystems, stocked with scavengers, parasites, and the occasional small predator that had blundered in and couldn't get out again. Mobility was no longer an awkward experiment. It was a competitive sport. Predators sprinted, darted, and lunged with calculated precision. Prey zigzagged, feinted, and doubled back, sometimes right into other predators, which made for short but memorable chases. The water column became a tangle of intersecting pursuits, each one ending with either a meal or a very confused loser. And as always, Earth kept the drama on a timer. Because somewhere in the not-so-distant geological future, the next twist was already in motion, one that would change not just who lived and died, but what life could even be, which, given Earth's track record, meant more complicated, more dangerous, and almost certainly messier.